There's a weariness that enters the soul not from walking too far, but from standing too long in spaces where no one truly sees you. You know this weariness. It arrives the moment you step into the crowded room, the bustling street, the gathering where voices multiply but meaning divides. It is not shyness that makes you retreat. It is not fear of people that sends you seeking solitude. It is something older, something the world has no name for because the world builds itself on noise and calls silence strange. You were taught that life happens where bodies gather, that joy lives in the collective celebration, that belonging means standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who share your space, but not your silence. And somewhere in the learning you began to believe that your preference for emptiness was a failing, a wound, a thing to be overcome. But let me speak of something you have always known but were taught to forget in order to survive. The soul that withdraws from the
crowd is not broken. It is remembering. Long before you understood words, you understood presence. You felt the weight of a room before you saw its walls. You sensed the exhaustion of forced smiles before you could name pretense. You knew in that ancient part of yourself that speaks without language, when a space held truth and when it held only performance. The crowded place, with its laughter that sounds like duty and its conversations that circle but never land, became for you not a celebration of life, but a betrayal of it. Not because you hate people, but because you love truth more. The world will tell you this is sensitivity. They will call it introversion, social anxiety, a preference for quiet. They will offer you words that make your nature manageable, explainable, small enough to fit inside their understanding. But what you carry is not a disorder of the nervous system. It is an integrity of the spirit. You do not hate crowds because you fear connection. You withdraw because you hunger for it so deeply that anything less than genuine presence feels like starvation, dressed as feast. Consider the child you were before the world taught you to doubt your own knowing. There was a moment, perhaps many moments, when you stood in the midst of noise and felt utterly alone. Not because no one spoke to you, but because no one truly listened. Not because you were invisible, but because what was visible was only the surface, the acceptable face you learned to wear, so the gathering would not notice your absence even as you stood among them. You learned early that crowded places demand a particular kind of death, the death of nuance, the death of depth, the death of the slow, sacred unfolding that real connection requires. And so you began to choose absence over that particular violence. You learned to say no to invitations that felt like obligations. You discovered that solitude was not loneliness, but relief, that an empty room could hold more truth than a
hall filled with voices competing to be heard, but not to hear. The world called this withdrawal. You knew it as return. Return to yourself. Return to the quiet where your thoughts could finish forming before being interrupted. Return to the space where your soul could breathe without performing its breathing for an audience. But the world does not make space for such returns easily. It builds itself on the assumption that more is better. More people, more stimulation, more noise masquerading as life. It teaches that the one who stands apart is the one who has failed to arrive. And in that teaching, you learn to question your own nature, to wonder if something was wrong with you, to force yourself into spaces that drained you, believing that endurance would eventually become enjoyment, that if you just tried harder, wanted it more, performed better, you would finally feel what others seemed to feel in the collective joy. You did not feel it, and the not feeling became its own kind of
loneliness. The loneliness of standing in the crowd and recognizing that you are the only one who notices how hollow it sounds, how the laughter echoes but does not land, how the conversations move across surfaces but never pierce them, how everyone is so busy being present that no one actually is. This is the particular sorrow of the soul that sees, not that it cannot join, but that it sees what joining costs, and the price is too high. There is an ancient knowing in you that understands this. It knows that true connection happens not in the multiplication of bodies, but in the meeting of depths. That two souls in genuine encounter hold more life than 1,000 in performative gathering. that the quality of presence matters infinitely more than its quantity. But this knowing has made you a stranger in a world that measures belonging by attendance, that confuses proximity with intimacy, that believes loneliness can be solved by simply adding more people to the room. You have tried to
explain this, perhaps. Tried to tell them that it is not the people you avoid, but the pretense. Not the gathering you fear, but the shallowness it demands. That you would walk through fire to sit with one soul in true meeting. But you cannot bear another evening of small talk that asks you to make yourself small. They do not understand. How could they? They have learned to find comfort in the very things that exhaust you. They have made peace with surfaces. They do not feel the cost of never going deeper. And so you carry this in silence, this preference that feels like exile, this need for space that the world interprets as rejection. You have learned to make excuses that sound reasonable, work obligations, fatigue, prior commitments, anything but the truth, which is that you cannot bear another hour in a place where your presence is noted but your essence is invisible, where you are expected to perform enthusiasm for interactions that leave you emptier than you arrived, where the crowd moves like a single organism and you are the cell that will not conform, the voice that will not blend, the soul that insists on remaining whole even when wholeness means standing alone. But here is what the world will not tell you, what it cannot tell you, because it has forgotten. Your withdrawal is not weakness, it is discernment. Your need for space is not dysfunction, it is wisdom. The soul that cannot pretend connection where none exists, that refuses to call noise communion or proximity presence, that walks away from the crowd to preserve its own integrity, this soul is not broken. It is awake. And wakefulness in a world that glorifies sleepwalking together will always look like strangeness. You did not lose your ability to connect. You lost your willingness to settle for its counterfeit. You did not fail at belonging. You simply recognize that belonging built on the erasure of your deepest self is not belonging at all, but disappearance with witnesses. The crowded place asks you to become less so that others can remain comfortable with their more. It asks you to dim so their brightness does not have to question itself. It asks you to join the performance and never mention that it is one. You could not do it. Something in you, something ancient and uncompromising, refused. Not because you wanted to be difficult, but because you could not forget what real presence feels like. The kind that happens in silence as much as speech, the kind that allows for pause, for depth, for the slow revelation of truth that cannot be rushed or performed. You have tasted that presence, perhaps rarely, perhaps only in moments, but enough to know that everything else is hunger pretending to be feast. And this knowing has cost you friendships that required you to be perpetually available, perpetually enthusiastic, perpetually present in ways that your soul could not sustain. Cost you opportunities that came packaged with networking events and social obligations.
You could not bring yourself to endure. Cost you the easy belonging that others seem to find in simply showing up and going along. You have paid for your integrity with a particular kind of isolation. The isolation of seeing what others do not see, of feeling what others do not feel, of needing what others do not need. But here in this moment, let me tell you what that cost has purchased. It has purchased your selfhood, your authenticity, your refusal to become a ghost of yourself, just to haunt the spaces where ghosts gather and call it living. You have kept something sacred that the crowd would have demanded you surrender. You have protected a flame that the wind of collective movement would have extinguished. You have chosen truth over comfort, depth over ease, solitude over the loneliness of standing in rooms full of people and feeling utterly unseen. This is not celebrated. The world does not give awards for such preservation. It does not understand why you would choose one.
Genuine conversation over 100 shallow ones. Why you would prefer an evening alone to a party where you must perform your participation. It sees your choices as deprivation. You know them as devotion. Devotion to something real, something whole, something that refuses to be divided into acceptable pieces and distributed among strangers who want your presence but not your truth. And then you realize the crowded place was never rejecting you. You were rejecting it. not from arrogance or superiority, but from a deeper loyalty. Loyalty to your own soul's requirements, to the truth that you cannot thrive in spaces that demand you shrink, that you cannot find yourself in places that ask you to get lost in the collective, that your nature is not meant to blend, but to remain distinct, not meant to merge, but to meet, not meant to disappear into the many, but to stand as one, whole and uncompromised. The pain you have felt, the isolation, the sense of being wrong in a world that seems so right about its wrongness, this has been the pain of awakening, of refusing to sleep just because everyone else has agreed that sleep is consciousness, of walking out of the dream even when the dream is shared by thousands, of choosing reality over agreement, truth over belonging, yourself over the version of yourself that would be easier for others to love. You are not broken, you are intact in a